At the Health and Human Rights Initiative, we very much believe, and my colleagues at the O'Neill Institute, I think, share this, rights go beyond legal norms, that if they are to be meaningful, they have to be part of our lived experiences. They are embodied experiences, and we need to understand what that means and what it means to be human and a subject of rights. In that way, aspirationally, I think there is nothing more powerful than art to convey, nothing more powerful than, the portrait of one person to convey what is universal about human dignity, much more than 100 international treaty texts or articles. I mean, who among us has not been undone by a 3-line poem or an exquisite piece of music or a powerful work of visual art?
I should start by saying that I graduated from college in 2008, so I have a background making art. And shortly after I graduated, I got indicted by the federal government. Entering into this system is really traumatic, and they basically strip you of all your societal kind of markings that make you who you are. But the one thing that they couldn't take from me was my ability to create. It served an act of resistance. It served as this medium that I could put a lot of that kind of anger, resentment, and hopelessness into, and kind of invest myself into something that would basically allow me to come out of this situation better than when I went in, right? So I wasn't gonna allow this time to kind of dictate who I am. But a lot of people don't have that opportunity, and they weren't privileged enough to go to college and graduate. So I'm in this 23-hour lockdown, and I was reading the newspapers, and my family sent me philosophical texts, which I was really interested in. I was reading Foucault's Discipline and Punish and thinking about the ideas that he talks about in how punishment transitioned from the corporal body and forcing people to come out and witness these executions in the town square as a way to kind of control the population, and how that transitioned into this idea of repentance and rehabilitation. The thing that connected to me pretty immediately was that in the process of reading these newspapers and myself being depicted within the newspaper as this drug kingpin, so it's this very singular depiction of an individual at one point in time, and it doesn't actually accurately represent who that person is. But that has a very real effect, because if you do that to a lot of people who come into contact with the criminal justice system, it forms these social norms and these ideas of people being this certain kind of mold, which is not true. If you think about the heads in the newspaper, they are these tiny decapitated heads which are within this black ink box. So it's kind of like an ink scaffold. So I began making those kinds of associations and thinking about prison-issued soap, which is also a material that is directly used for sanitation and purification, and that related to ideas of the penitentiary, which is all based off of the idea of repentance. So the soap as a material started to have this conversation with the pre-existing concepts behind what our prison system is supposed to be about. It's not about rehabilitation. I began transferring images of offenders onto the surface of the soaps. I had to figure out a way to get the works out and protect them, because they're very delicate as well. But I didn't want to just make containers that had no connection to the piece. Another thing that I found really interesting was the way that other guys on the block, the way that they spent their time. The same way that I was making artwork to disconnect from this environment and invest myself in something, a lot of guys played cards. I began to collect the cards after the guys were done playing with them, because they would always purchase new decks because they'd get beat up, and then they started passing me their old used cards. So it became a kind of communal process where they knew I was making this art project. I started collecting the cards and then going through and kind of systematically cutting out the faces of kings, jacks, and queens. So I built these containers, and in order to even cut through the cards, I had to break open a AAA battery, and there's a connector that goes from positive to the negative in there, and it's like a tiny piece of metal. And I sharpened it on the floor of my cell and then built like a handle around it using deodorant labels. That is the entire exhibition. So this is basically a year of my life, 12 hours a day, probably more, cutting through each card. There's over 6,000, close to 7,000 cards in this total installation. It's this very kind of repetitive process, and for me it also captures the kind of plasticity of time and the way that time registers also shift within this environment from being a kind of linear, progressive movement to being just kind of cyclical. It's just this repetitive process. After I got sentenced as a nonviolent offender, I'm basically in a maximum security penitentiary. I was terrified at first. But after being there for a little while, I began to make artwork and I began to connect with people through that artwork. And I had come to find out that everyone there was exactly like me. I began making this project, which is Apocalyptine 1638-9067. This is image transfers out of the newspaper using hair gel onto the surface of prison-issued sheets. So again, using contraband to kind of convey a message. And the reason that this material is important, like the soaps, is that it's produced in a program called Unicor. Unicor is the production arm of the Bureau of Prisons. They have massive factories all across the country using inmate labor to produce things to keep the prison self-sustainable, prison sheets, spoons, trays. Again, over time, this project grew into 39 prison bed sheets. This is 15 feet tall by 40 feet long. It took me 3 years to make this. All image transfers, hand drawings back over top of the image transfers. And for me, this became a kind of surrogate body of sorts. I was in this environment where, you know, there are so many things that could have led to me staying there forever, right, or dying there. This was kind of like my way to make an artwork that would encapsulate this experience and also project me outside of the prison walls and allowed me to transcend the prison walls.
I want to start with you, Jesse, and I want to kind of bring you back to the first days when you were put in prison and you had just graduated, your life was on track, and all of a sudden the life plan that you had created was dramatically interrupted. What was the way you thought about your life, about the plans that you had made and how they were being broken down? And how did art play a role in building that up?
The shock of getting arrested wasn't the thing. It was just like the reckless disregard for the law. I had always assumed that they need physical evidence that exists, and they don't. And I think the fact that I was facing 10 years to life and just like the consequences that kind of came along with that. But I made a conscious decision early on, one, that I was going to take personal responsibility, and two, that even though I disagree with drug laws almost completely, I made a very conscious decision as well to come out of this situation better than when I went in.
I wonder if from all your vast policy experience, you could talk to us a little bit about the broader dehumanization that happens in prison.
I think there's a tendency to think, what was this, incredible, wonderful person stuck in those depraved conditions for? What an injustice, what a horrible thing. How good it is that he got out. Whereas the way I'm thinking of it, and I know the way he's thinking of it, the way he talked about it, is that there are thousands and upon thousands of Jessies, right, who are languishing in prison. Some of them are innocent. Some of them are for nonviolent drug offenses. But many of them are also people who did something bad at one point in their life and who are paying a steep price for decade after decade after decade. And to bring in the research side of it now, what I've learned in researching and writing a book that's coming out this summer that looks at the US compared to other advanced democracies is that we are truly exceptional in this country, but not in a good way. The way we treat people, the conditions we put people in, what we inflict upon people is inhumane, it's barbaric. And I think it's extraordinary the political nature of his art. I read into the conditions. I see him in there because I'm in a prison on a regular basis, and I see what it's like there, and I see how hard it is. And it's an act of resistance, what he did. It's an act of art, but it's just as political as it is artistic. And while there's so many other people who are in prison who don't have his artistic ability, they have other abilities, they have other creativity, they have other forms of genius that don't get appreciated. So I hope that people come away with an appreciation of the thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, when you count those who've been released, who have a similar story and who are just as good and who are also worthy of our admiration.
Much of the questioning of this is about who's guilty, who's innocent. What the drug laws are not necessarily just. And we deal with that a lot at the O'Neill Institute in other areas of health. We deal a lot on drug policy, but also in sexual and reproductive health. Whose suffering counts? Is a 13-year-old who is raped and has an abortion guilty or innocent? And is the fetus innocent? So we deal with these social discourses and norms a lot, and I think part of listening to a personal experience is beginning to question those and see where the war on drugs stops and the opioid crisis, which largely affects a different population in this country and is a public health, not a criminal justice issue, begins. And how those discourses are framed, which is what this kind of dialogue is really all about.